There's been a lot buzzing through the internet about, did God cause the coronavirus? And so that's what I want to talk about today. Is God to blame for this? And people want to know, why did God do this? So let's talk about that. Why did God create this? They're asking. Is it God's will to make people suffer? Is it God's will to afflict people and to make them pay for their sins? Is he punishing us? What is going on? So the first one I want to start out with is that, it's a very common saying that people say, well, God is in control. And something we need to understand about that, whatever people mean by that, and I think different people mean different things by it, but they don't mean that God causes everything that happens. And other people would say, well, isn't God the creator? Doesn't God do everything that happens? Doesn't God create everything? Well, yes, God created everything, but when we say God created everything, we're talking about in time past. When he was the creator, he created everything. But that doesn't mean that he makes everything happen that's happened. He created everything at the beginning, but there's been a lot that has happened since then that is not God's doing. And when people say God is in control, let's not be under the misunderstanding that God does everything that is done. For instance, it should be pretty simple to say God did not create planes, trains, and automobiles. People did that. God created the world, and God created the cosmos, and the earth and people, but he didn't create trains, planes, and automobiles. So we can also say there are a lot of things that are around now that God didn't create. And so let's not be under the misunderstanding that just because a virus exists, that God created it. We know that God didn't create sin. Romans 5 tell us that sin came into the world because of Adam and Eve. God did not create sin, and God is not responsible for sin. God doesn't sin. 1 John 1:5 tells us that God doesn't sin, and he doesn't create sin. He's not responsible for sin. So even, again, when people say God is in control, that's not to say that God is doing everything that happens. God can't abide sin. The Bible's very clear about that. Sin is falling short of the glory of God. Sin is a separation from God. And so God is not doing sin. God is not making sin. God is not making us sin. That's a self-contradiction to say that God is doing that. So there are things that God does not create. I've established that, and there are things that God does not do. Sin is transgressing the law of God. So God is not going to be a kingdom working against himself. 1 John 3:4 talks about that sin is a transgression. And so it's a self-contradiction that God would transgress his own law. Sin is wrongdoing. That's in 1 John 5:17. And God doesn't do anything wrong. So we can't say that everything that happens is something that God did, because that's not the way it works. God doesn't cause sin. Matthew 13:41 and Galatians 2:17 tell us that. God does not do that. God is not making that happen. God himself doesn't sin. There are plenty of texts that talk about that. John 8:46, 2 Corinthians 5:21, Hebrews 4:15. And so there are many things that God doesn't do. There are lots of things that exist that God didn't create. James 1:13 tells us that God doesn't make people, God doesn't tempt people. That people are tempted because of what's inside of them, not because of anything that God does, that God doesn't tempt people. We know that God doesn't do evil, and the evil that people do is not God's doing. And so I hope that I'm establishing that God didn't create everything that exists, and God doesn't do everything that happens. James 1:17 tells us that God does what's good, that it's the good things that come from God. It's the blessings that come from God. Now, Hebrews also tells us that Sometimes God disciplines us, and sometimes we learn from the Old Testament and the New Testament that sometimes God judges people for their sin. But God doesn't do everything that happens. God doesn't make everything happen that happens. Sin entered the world through humanity. And so let's not blame God for these things that are not his doing. Well, then the next question that comes up is, okay, well, if God didn't do it, well, then God allowed it. And so is it his will to afflict people? Is it his will to make people suffer or to let people suffer because he allows such things? Well, let's deal with that too. I think allow is just a misleading term in that sense, and it takes us in the wrong direction. For instance, one could say, well, did the United States allow the coronavirus to come inside its borders? Well, in a very technical sense, yeah, I guess we did, because we could have shot everyone who came into the country after a certain point, that as soon as the plane landed, we could have blown up the plane, and we could have put their corpses in a space shuttle and blasted them to outer space so that there was no viral infection of the United States. And that if there did happen to be a viral outbreak in a particular city, we could drop a nuclear bomb on that city and stop it. And you can see we're into quite a bit of nonsense when we're saying, well, then the United States allowed the coronavirus to come in. It's really not an accurate way to talk about what happened or what should have happened or what needs to happen. Allow is just a lousy choice of term because it takes us to a land of misunderstanding that doesn't help, and it's not accurate. And it's not a realistic way of looking at the problem or the solution. In the same way, neither is it the right idea to talk about that God allowed the coronavirus. It's not an accurate way of perceiving God's activity or God's involvement, God's motives, or God's behavior. It's a bad choice of word that makes us think that, well, then God is a terrible person. And so it's not the kind of term that's helpful. It's the wrong word that leads to wrong understanding. And so let's talk about something different than that. Ready? Right. Okay. So the next question that people ask, well, did God do this because he was angry at the world? Is this God's judgment? 2 Chronicles 7:13 tells us that, yes, sometimes God judges the world by sending things like pestilence or famine. God occasionally does that, but is there a reason to believe that the coronavirus is God judging the world and that he's angry with the world? Well, I could say with some amount of certainty that God is angry at the world. I could say with some amount of certainty that the way we behave as a people and humanity grieves God very much. But we can't conclude that God has given us the coronavirus as some kind of a judgment on our sin unless there's some kind of confirmation or prophetic word of that. When you look through the Bible, when God is going to judge people that way, he gives a prophetic message ahead of time, and he says, this is what I'm going to do. And it's because the people have done this and that or such and whatever. And because he has done that, because the people have acted this way, here's what I'm going to send. And I'm going to send this plague of locusts, or I'm going to send a famine, or there's something that's going to happen because there's a prophetic word that accompanies what God is doing. In this case, I'm not aware of any prophetic or explanatory word. It's just people who afterwards have speculated and said, well, maybe God is judging the world. Well, that's not how we evaluate God's actions. And so we can't conclude that God is doing this to judge the world unless there's some kind of a confirmatory word from God that that's what's going on. Instead, it's better to look at this. Look, God created viruses to evolve. It's part of what they do. They do it very well. I mean, God's design was brilliant. Viruses evolve. They are tremendously excellent at this, and they are very adaptive to their environment and to sequences. But there are reasons. There are reasons that God doesn't jump in and prevent every problem and solve every issue. That's a completely different sort of conversation as to why the world was set up in a dynamic way rather than in a static way. And there are some very good reasons that the world is dynamic rather than static, but that's a different video. There are reasons that God doesn't jump in and prevent every problem before it happens. But then somebody would say, well, then God set up the conditions for it to happen. So God is still responsible for the coronavirus. You see, people are so determined to blame God here that they say, well, God created it. And I've shown to you, God doesn't create everything that's happened. And then they say, well, God allowed it. And I say, well, allow is just a lousy term that doesn't take us to any understanding. And they said, well, then God is doing it to judge us. And well, we haven't had a prophetic word that would lead us in that direction. And then they say, well, then God knew it would happen and he set up the conditions for it to happen. Well, yeah, but the difference is this, is whether God was being malicious in the way he created the world to be able to adapt and be dynamic and adjust and breathe and mutate. Was God being malicious when he created the world to be dynamic and to have this evolving environment, or was this an excellent way to set up the world? See, the former is cruel. The latter is not only necessary, but it's advantageous. And so if God set up the world to be a dynamic, breathing, living, changing environment, that's an advantage. And God is not to be blamed for creating the world so that it adapted and breathed and mutated and adjusted, right? But we've already established that God doesn't make everything happen. He created the world to be dynamic, and so there are earthquakes, there are volcanoes, there are hurricanes and tornadoes, there are viruses. But that doesn't mean God makes these things. That doesn't mean God did them. It doesn't mean he made them happen. God is not cruel or malicious. He created the world to function. And it's an advantage, it's a benefit, it's the way life works so well. And that's a real difference. So it is God's will that viruses do what viruses do. They have biological help to them. They have biological harm to them. They adapt and they evolve. And that's what God approved. And this one evolved the way it did. Possibly even with some help from scientists, even though that's hard to know. But the way viruses evolve in animal life and then come to human life is another possible way this happened. And that's the reason the coronavirus exists. Not because God did it, not because God allowed it, not because God is malicious or cruel, and not because he's necessarily angry with the world. If he hasn't told us that. So then the next question, well then, why did God create the world where that was even possible? Is it his will to make people suffer? No. God created the world with cause and effect, and it's an advantage and a benefit that it works that way. Conditions develop according to cause and effect processes. Conditions develop according to the way the world works, that God designed it to work, and not because God ordains everything that happens, right? It's a necessary part of cause and effect that God allows it to play through. Cause and effect is the only thing that makes science possible. If cause and effect were not a principle of life, we wouldn't be able to have science or have any conclusions because there would be no regularity, there would be no predictability. And if there were no predictability, there could be no science. And so this is essential for science. Not only that, it's essential for knowledge. Cause and effect are the only thing that makes reasoning possible because it's the only thing that makes us know how things generally work and how things are generally going to work. Because if every day is a roll of the dice, if every instant of every day is a roll of the dice or a deal of the cards, then nothing is ever predictable, and I can't even use my brain to think because it doesn't take me anywhere, because nothing is predictable. Nothing makes sense if that's the way the world works. And so there's actually a benefit to cause and effect. There's a benefit to God creating the world the way he did and then letting it do what he created it to do. And so, God didn't make the coronavirus. He didn't cause it to happen. He didn't allow it to happen. These are just misunderstandings of what is going on and how God works in the world. And then people accuse, well, if God didn't create the coronavirus, then God is not omnipotent, and therefore he's not God. Omnipotence doesn't mean that God does everything that happens. And omnipotence doesn't mean that God can even do everything. That's not what omnipotence means. Omnipotence doesn't even mean that there are no limits to what God can do. Look at Mark 6:5. That'll show you that there are limits to what God can do. What omnipotence means is that God is able to do things that are the proper objects of his power. Of course, it's no contradiction that God can bring about whatever is possible, no matter how many possibilities there are, and that his power is all-sufficient power. In other words, he can never be overwhelmed, he can never be exhausted, he can never be contained. He is able to overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles and problems. He has complete power, though he lets nature take its course, because that's what he created it to do. Yes, he has some power. He has power over the course of history, but he chooses only to use that power as his wisdom demands. He only chooses to use his power over nature as his wisdom demands. See, God runs the world according to wisdom, not just a raw display of power. He has the power to change human personality, but only as people invite him. Only as individuals allow him to change their personality, since he can't interfere with the free will of people. He has the power to conquer death and sin. He has the power to save a human being for eternity. And he has power over the spiritual realm. So what omnipotence means is that God's will is never frustrated. And whatever he chooses to do, he accomplishes. And it's his wisdom that governs that choice, that he has the ability to do it. But there are lots of things that God can't do. For instance, God can't do what is logically absurd or self-contradictory. For instance, God cannot create a square circle. He can't have a married bachelor. These things don't even make sense. And so we can't dip into the absurd to try to pin God in a corner and show that he's not God. God cannot act contrary to his nature. Self-contradiction is not possible for God. God can only be self-consistent. And so what that means is God can't lie. God can't sin. God can't create evil. God cannot fail to do what he has promised. That would mean God is flawed. The theology of omnipotence rejects the possibility of dualism, that there are equal powers of good and evil and of right and wrong, and that these are in a balance, like Star Wars, a balance in the Force, or like Taoism, that there's the yin and the yang that are always in balance. It's not like that. God is omnipotent and he is sovereign. But that doesn't mean he can do everything. There are lots he can't do. As I said, he can't do anything that's logically absurd. He can't do anything that's self-contradictory. He can't interfere with the free will of man. And one place for that is Luke 13:34. If God can override human free will, then it's not free. Then it's not free will. Free will doesn't make sense if God can override it. God can't change the past. Time by definition is linear in one direction. And God created it that way. You know, God cannot be self-limited. So there are lots of things that God can't do. So when you say, well, God didn't stop, he didn't create if he didn't create the coronavirus, then he's not omnipotent. That's absurd. You don't understand what omnipotence is if that's what you're accusing God of. So I'll close with this because this is getting long enough. People would say, do you think COVID-19 has a purpose then? Okay, if God didn't create it, if God didn't allow it, if that's not the proper way to talk about it, if it's not God's wrath on the world, does COVID-19 even have a purpose? You know, where does this go? I said, yeah. I think COVID-19 has shown us that there are a lot of things that it has accomplished. You know, I think it has been effective in turning people's attentions away from things that don't matter so much. We're spending more times with our families. We are spending more time evaluating our lives. And, you know, the coronavirus has been helpful at telling us, you know, helping us to understand a little bit about what matters and what doesn't. The coronavirus has been teaching us a lot about cooperation. We see, in a sense, the whole world is coming together here. We see communities coming together, trying to fight off this thing. The whole world has never been engaged in a battle like this, where we're all working together against this virus. And so it has taught us a lot about cooperation. It has taught us a lot about vulnerability, where maybe we had not planned for the future the way we should have, where maybe we have not, maybe we're not as invulnerable as we thought. It's teaching us not only about political vulnerability, supply chain vulnerability, but also our own personal health and our well-being and how vulnerable we are as people. I think the coronavirus has helped to turn people's attention towards spiritual things in that same sense of vulnerability and what is God doing and how is this working. And I think that possibly there are a lot of people that are thinking about the afterlife and about God's purposes and God's actions in the world. And these are great conversations to have. So underneath of the video in your comments, I'd be glad to talk with you, or come to my website at www.thethirdchoice.org. That's with a 3RD, not with the word third. Come to the website. We'll talk about it. I'd love to converse about these things with you, but I think definitely we have seen that COVID-19 has had some very positive benefits and purposes in and amongst the terrible things that have happened with it. So thanks for tuning in, and talk to me about some of the thoughts that I've talked about today.